Nicola Sturgeon may be pushing for a second independence referendum in Scotland in the wake for Brexit, but it turns out this could trigger everybody's nightmare scenario, an expert claimed in an Unearthed podcast. Miss Sturgeon, Scotland's First Minister and the leader of the Scottish Nationalist Party, SNP, has campaigned for independence in Europe throughout her premiership. Like all her predecessors, her party has argued in favour of separating from the rest of the UK and joining the EU since the 90s. The SNP then lost the 2014 independence referendum, but Ms Sturgeon announced recently that she has put legislation in place to request a second referendum from Westminster in the wake of Brexit. She argued that, because the majority of voters in Scotland voted to stay in the EU, the country is being taken out of the bloc against its will and therefore should have a chance to join the European Union again independent of the UK. In BBC Radio 4 programme Brexit, What Happens to Scotland, broadcast in March 2016 prior to the referendum, programme host Sarah Smith explored the logistics of Scotland leaving the UK to join the EU. Could Scotland just slip into the seat vacated by the UK? Dr Dan Keneally, the expert witness to a Scottish parliamentary committee which looked into Scotland's entry to the EU in 2014, said, "Timing would be key, and I think everybody's nightmare scenario, the real headache scenario, is what happens if the UK, having voted to leave, is in the middle of this departure process trying to settle its relationship with the EU. And then you have at the same time the UK itself breaking up and Scotland knocking on the door trying to get into the European Union. Then the timing becomes really quite tricky. In a perfect world, which it isn't, what you would look to do in that situation is basically sign all of the treaties, all of the documents on the same day. So Britain would sign a piece of paper with the European Union setting out the terms of its exit, and Scotland would sign a piece of paper setting out the terms of its succession. However, he remained pessimistic it probably won't work out that neatly, politics being politics. The expert continued, "My best guess, and this is obviously an area where we are speculating, would be that it would take longer for Scotland to arrange the terms of its entry than Britain to arrange the terms of its exit. Therefore there would be a limbo period, where Scotland would be trying to seek membership while part of neither the UK nor the EU. Britain has spent more than 2 years attempting to negotiate its exit from the bloc, and there's a possibility the Brexit deadline might be extended yet again beyond the 31st of October. Ms Sturgeon has implied she plans to put a new referendum to the people of Scotland in 2020. Britain may have crashed out of the EU without a deal by then, or it could have agreed to Boris Johnson's withdrawal deal with the EU and therefore be in the transition period. To pursue independence in Europe, Scotland would have to work out a series of terms around its entry as well, as Dr Keneally pointed out, especially as the UK had negotiated some exceptions with its own membership which may not necessarily apply to an independent Scotland. For instance, the UK is not in the Eurozone. If Scotland were to join the EU independently later, it is likely it would have to take up the European currency, and this would probably take some time to integrate. The Schengen area, the free movement area, is, according to Mr. Keneally, the really interesting one because it creates the possibility of borders. The 1985 Schengen Arrangement was a treaty which abolished most internal borders in the EU. If Scotland were to leave the UK and join the EU, the Scotland-England border may cause problems in terms of negotiations over how people and goods pass between the two countries, just as the land border on the island of Ireland has been a frequent sticking point throughout Brexit talks. However, Mr. Johnson has come up with a solution to the Irish border which was accepted by the EU last week. Dr. Keneally also said, now again when the border issue was looked at it in the context of the referendum, most people agreed that the historical common travel area that applies across the British Isles would be recognised and honoured by other European member states, largely because of pragmatism, but there's no legal route that has to be followed in the situation. This would a largely political settlement. The UK also currently has a special arrangement for its budget contributions, where it gets an amount of money back, a rebate, on its budgetary contributions. Other critics of the SNP have pointed out the country has a large deficit which The Guardian reported in August was 7 times higher than the UK as a whole last year. In order to resolve it, the EU may try to impose a strict austerity program as seen in countries like Ireland and Greece after the financial crash.